So, like I say, about 2.5 years, 3 years ago, we started this church revitalization network, and that's where I met Jack. We actually met in his building, and so Jack and I have been, wrestling through this idea of revitalization. Jack also did a replant just down the street at Free Christian Church. I'm sure he'll talk about all that. But he just retired. What, May?
June.
July.
You can't remember.
He's probably still going.
That's why I retired. Couldn't remember.
I have
for a year.
I have thoroughly enjoyed getting to know Jack. I appreciate his wisdom, his insight, his friendship, and you're in for a treat tonight as he shares his story. So, Jack, it's all yours.
Thank you, Shane.
Oh, certainly. Oh, and I do have other things to pass out when you're done.
All right. Little outline for you. Keep on track. I'm actually only on sabbatical because in September, Lord willing, we'll start another replant. It's like the movie Groundhog Day, remember, reincarnation is punishment. People think it's reward. It's not. It's punishment. We didn't get it right the first time, so we have to do it all over again. I don't have 35 years. Well, maybe I do. Think I have 35 years, darling?
Sure.
Moses lived to 120.
Eat a lot of oat bran because I hear that's what does it. It's great. What a great blessing to be here with you folks. Replanting is the hardest thing in the world, but it is also an incredible calling. And you're here because God's called you to it, and we'll talk a little bit. I want to kind of share with you 8 lessons that I was told to limit this to the first 10 years of my ministry. Well, that was 25 years ago when that ended. So, some of these lessons I can't guarantee weren't learned later in life, but they're lessons. My subtitle was going to be 8 lessons I learned in replanting, some the hard way, because let's face it, that's how we learn. I made a lot of mistakes. By God's mercy, I survived. None of them were fatal, thank God. And the result is I'm so glad God called us to do this. I wouldn't trade it for the world. And we're actually going to, in a little bit, I'll pass out a copy of the history of the church that my wife and I put together. It tells the founding of the church, which is a very interesting, unique story. I'll tell you a little bit about that. But also the 35 years that we were there. Kind of to pass on some of the things that happened in those years for people in the church to sort of know where they came from. So we'll pass that out to you later. Let me just tell you very briefly about who I am. I grew up in Massachusetts, born in Boston, grew up in the town of Weymouth, came to Christ at 16, was raised in a Christian family, but didn't hear the gospel, and our family attended a UCC church in Weymouth, where I definitely didn't hear the gospel. I tell people I had to leave the church to find Christ, and that's true. And so I came to Christ at 16, went to a college nearby where I grew up, Eastern Nazarene College in Quincy, Massachusetts. I wasn't Nazarene, but it was a good school. It was nearby. And when I was 20 years old, my junior year, God called me into the ministry. I knew beyond a doubt that was my call, but I didn't want to do that. I had no good models of pastoral ministry, and it was an idea that did not originate with me, and if I could have dodged it, I would have. For the next 10 years, I did make a deal with God. I'm not supposed to do that, but I did. I said, all right, I will go to theological school. I'll do that at least. It was during the Vietnam War, and so by going to theological school, I wasn't going to get drafted. Now, I'm patriotic. If I got drafted, I would have served. But I decided to go to theological school in Southern California, so it was a choice. Southern California, Vietnam. And so I went to theological school. During that time, I, again, trying to sort of dodge the other draft, God's draft, I spent a year working with the University Christian Fellowship in Southern California. Yeah, great, wonderful organization. Learned a lot, but realized that was not my calling. Took my last year at Gordon Conwell, which had just 2 years before, 2 or 3 years before, come together as Gordon and Conwell, and so transferred there. Began doing youth ministry in the town of Westwood. We got a family here from Medfield, for the Medfield Knights. There they are. 20 inches of snow today in Medfield. And so we did youth ministry. I didn't marry a seminary wife. Kathy and I met. Long story, won't get into that. We met and married, and Kathy came to Christ. It was missionary dating, and I was supposed to do that. Led her to the Lord, threw her into youth ministry. She's got some great stories to tell. We may tell some of those tomorrow. But anyway, she survived that. We had 6 wonderful years doing youth ministry. I was still dodging. I would have loved to have gone on doing youth ministry forever. But when I was 29, God began to tap on my shoulder again. I resisted it. Meanwhile, I'd actually started working on a D-Min, Doctor of Ministry at Andover, Newton. We got an Andoverite. There's the Andover Newton. There he is. Great school. Great, especially in pastoral counseling. So I was working on a degree there because I wanted to go into pastoral counseling. Still dodging God all the way. Finally, at the age of 30, I just turned 30. Put off God for 10 years. I reached a crisis where I realized I couldn't fight him any longer. And I still remember the moment with tears, talking to an older pastor who was really very wise and guiding me. I just broke down before God and said, all right, I don't want to do this, but if that's what you want, I'll do it. 2 weeks later, sometimes God moves fast when you're really ready. 2 weeks later, we got a call from a church called Free Christian Church in Andover. I've lived in Massachusetts all my life. I didn't even know where Andover was. Everybody said, oh, it's a nice town, you'll love it. So that spring, we were called to Free Christian Church. My first pastor, it was a dying church, and you'll see the history of it. They were getting ready to close the doors, talking about closing the doors. Sunday morning, maybe about 60 people. The membership was quite big, about 300 people. We had 75 people over 75. That was an easy number to remember. And I, Kathy and I said, well, I was 30, she's younger, a lot younger. And what? Dog years. Anyway, the church, we were the youngest people in the church. We had our first baby that first year. They had to reopen the nursery, the storage room. So we know, some of you are in situations like that. The talk in Andover was just 3 miles away. The talk in Andover was that this church is going to die, it's going to merge. There were 3 other congregational, 3 other UC, it was a UCC church, it's 4 C's now. 3 other UCC churches in Andover. The talk was that the Free Christian Church is a weak cousin. They're going to have to merge with someone and go out of existence. And that's what that was the expectation. So we said maybe we'll stay 3 years and we'll do something else. I always in the back of my mind, I want to get back into counseling. I want to do that. And so 35 years later in July, God concluded that ministry. And it's in great hands. A young man who's 35 now. He was our youth ministry. He was there for 10 years, became a pastor. We actually have a second site in North Andover, about 2 miles from here. And he pastored that. Had a great experience. This was just a beautiful transition. Maureen is from our church. She's on staff there. And how's it going, Mo?
Awesome.
Good. But the church is bigger than any one of us. So that's my story in a nutshell. And now we're going to do it again starting in September. We have a year off. We're living in Maine. We have a house on a lake that was bought up there. We love 47 degrees and sunny when we left this afternoon to come to cold Massachusetts, snowy from Maine. It was beautiful. I was gloating all the way. And so in the fall we'll start again. God's called us to pastor a church that gets about 60 on a Sunday morning. Again, we're among the youngest people there, so you can imagine how old they were. It's like Groundhog Day, all over again. But we're excited about it.
Are you going to reopen the nursery?
Well, we talked about Moses. How about Abraham? This just fell on the floor. Where's Jim? Did Jim leave?
No, I'm here.
Oh, is that all right? This
Yeah.
fell on the floor. I can't see
I don't
this.
need it.
I'm here.
This thing fell on the floor.
What?
The recorder fell on the
I just put it back on your phone.
All right, it's all right.
Is it still on?
It says folder A.
Yeah. No, is it not recording?
Should I hit record?
I don't know.
Sorry, I got exuberant.
That's all right.
Thinking about that nursery being open again. I understand.
I love the old guy
Yeah. I've given up doing that. Okay. So I want to do 8 lessons, and I'm going to try to move through this. Beware when a preacher puts his watch on the podium. That means nothing. Okay. But I'm
When
gonna
his
try to-
wife is in the congregation,
Yes.
it means something. She doesn't watch.
That is my third base coach. Tells me whether to steal, slide, stay, whatever. She may talk about that tomorrow. Very important role of the pastor's wife. But I want to leave some time for questions with you. All right. You have the outline there in front of you. The first is the remain principle. And this, I'm going to give you some scripture. This is a familiar passage in 1 Corinthians 7. Paul is talking about, he's preaching, as you know, to a very complicated, socially, demographically, culturally confused church in Corinth. And people are coming to Christ, and they don't know what they should do. They don't know whether they should, for instance, he's talking to Christians who Gentiles rather, they don't know whether they should become Jewish. He's talking to Jews who have come to Christ. They don't know whether they should become Gentiles. Leave all that behind. Because the transforming power of Christ is so great. There are single people married, should we marry? There are married people who are married to non-believers. Should we stay with these people or should we leave them? There are slaves. Christ has liberated me. Should I resist my slavery? Should I, flee? And so there's all this going on, and he gives them a principle, and I call it the remain principle. Let me read just the one verse, and you can read the whole passage. It really starts at verse 8. But in verse 24, he says, brothers, each man is responsible to God, should remain in the situation God called him to. And so basically he's saying to the Gentiles, don't try to become Jewish. You're in Christ now, don't take on all that baggage. To the Jews he's saying, keep your culture. Don't be bound by it, don't be legalistic, but keep it. That's who you are. He's saying to the single, if you can stay single, stay single. But there's escape clauses here, because God is not, this is not punishment. We're not, fated to something. So he says to the single, basically if you fall in love, this language is a little stronger, if you burn with passion. I'll say if you fall in love, get married, it's okay. To the slaves he says, if you can get your freedom, get it. Freedom's a great thing, but if you can't, then remain. As I said, when we first came to the church, in the back of my mind, I was going to stay just a few years and then do something else. I had a dream. I don't know whether it was in the first year or two, but in this dream, I was in a house. And a house is a classic symbol in dreams for your life. And in this house, I was trying to find my way out of the house. I couldn't, there was no back door to the house. And the front door was obstructed or something, I don't remember all the details. And it was a vivid dream, but it was kind of an almost panicky dream because I couldn't find my way out of the house. And I woke up and thinking about this, and I realized God was saying, I have put you in this ministry. You're not to find a way out. when it's time for you to leave, I'll tell you. And so my resume, I have a resume, I have a profile. It's dated 1976. It's yellow with age. I literally never updated it. We had opportunities to go. We had a wonderful opportunity a number of years ago to go to pastor UCC Church in Hawaii. Even go to UCC Church in Pearl City, near Honolulu. We've been to Honolulu, we've been to Pearl City, it's beautiful. But God said no. And I had a few other opportunities, not as exciting as that perhaps. But I wanted to leave many, many times in that 35 years. I gotta be honest with you. But I could not honestly say God had said, you're released. And that's the remain principle. Paul is talking, in one of the words he uses, it kind of has the idea of apportionment or assignment to it. It's probably a military term. And so he's talking about the fact that this is your post. You've been assigned to this post. And you stay at it until he says that you're to go. We're restless, though. I was restless. We're all restless as human beings. And we tend to, can I just move this? Just move this aside. Ah! There. There was a trip over. We always err on the side of wanting to do something else. And so when we have an obstacle coming our way or resistance or whatever, we interpret it as a sign that maybe it's time to leave. Paul is saying, err on the side of staying. That's the remain principle. And when you see resistance, assume that that means you're on the right track. And that this resistance is coming against what God wants to do. It's a very different way of thinking, but it keeps you from going crazy. Otherwise, you're whipsawed, you're vacillated, back and forth. Should I stay? Should I go? Should I stay? Should I go? That's a heck of a way to live your life. And so, I wish I could say I settled it once and for all and never looked back. That'd be a lot. But I knew. There were times when I looked, I said, God, is this a call out? And I could never, in all honesty, say it was. And so people say, how do you stay 35 years? That's how you stay 35 years, sheer obedience to the call. And I am so glad I stayed. It's like kids. Some of you have young kids. We've got 3 grown married daughters. We love them. They're wonderful. Kids get better with age. Hang in there, folks. Don't get rid of them. The best is yet to come when they're adults. And you can relate to them as adults. And I got 3 wonderful sons-in-law that I love to hang out with. And replanting, I believe, if God keeps you where you are, it will get better with age. I'm so glad I stayed. Now, sometimes you can't stay. If God does call us out, and we have to be obedient to that. That's what's important. 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, a little church in Manchester that I preached at, Manchester, Maine, the Lakes District of Maine, near Augusta, near where we have our home. I used to preach there. They said, Jack, you ready to step down? Would you be our pastor? I said, no. They called back the next year. And I even sent them some names I thought would work out. Are you ready yet? No. They called a 3rd time. I said no. And then I sensed God say, call them back. This is the time. And fortunately the church had put in place a transition process, thinking that the day would come. I thought I'd stay till 70. Now 65. I thought I'd stay till 70. But God said no. It was it. 35 is good. And so that's our story. And that's why if you can stay and assume that God wants you to stay, err on that side. And if not, you'll know. You're not going to miss it. He can communicate with you in a million different ways. You're not going to miss it. Err on the side of staying. All right, that's the remain principle. Let's move on. We're missionaries. This, I think, is pretty obvious, but we forget it. The passage I have here is a great one. It's actually one that God used to call me into the ministry. It's Jesus. He's going through all of the villages, preaching the good news, healing every disease and sickness, Matthew 9. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. Jesus has compassion on the ministry. I heard Harold Ockingay, his name was mentioned by Jim, first president of Gordon Conwell, pastor of Park Street Church. I heard him preach on this on the radio when I was in college. And God used that verse to call me to the pastor. So it's very, very precious to me. But he has compassion on the flocks because they're lost. They're harassed and helpless. And I think the word for helpless is prostrate. We're actually down, way down. That's who we're called to minister to. We're missionaries. And we forget that sometimes. When we forget that, when we don't have that expectation, that missionary expectation, we can set ourselves up for disappointment. The people will disappoint us because we forget. You know, my people were good people, but they were pagans. They were not liberals. They just didn't ever, they really didn't know the Lord. A handful did, and they were all in the pulpit committee. They called us. But the others didn't. They were good people, though, but they were lost. And they did some strange things. There was some strange practices in that church. I'll tell you a few about some of them as we go on. And I had to realize they didn't know any better. They didn't know the Lord. Now, maybe you have people who know the Lord. Maybe you're in more of an evangelical setting. But I'd be willing to bet that they're immature. Because the church probably wouldn't have come to the point where they let people like me take a church. And they say, well, he can't do any worse. He'll die anyway. I mean, if the people were mature spiritually, they wouldn't have called me. They didn't know the Lord. And we forget that. We think these people are Christians. And we set ourselves up for disappointment. Bill Boylan, who's the pastor of Whiteville Parish Church, Jim's church. You guys know that. And Bill was a mentor to me. In fact, he's a mentor. He's still there. He's been there now in his 40 plus years. I want to say 45, 44, 40 years. And but he was a mentor to me at the UCC church, and to other UCC pastors, evangelical pastors, mostly Gordon Conwell guys, scattered to New England. And we gathered together. And Bill, we were all moaning and groaning about how hard our life was. Replanting. We didn't use the word replanting back then. That's a great term. It's so helpful. Just don't tell your people, oh, you're a replanting church. What? No. It's a code word. We use it among ourselves. We know what we're talking about. They don't want to be an experiment. Right? And so we're all moaning and complaining and whining. And Bill says, let me tell you, make a little parable here. He said, let's imagine that you're all Southern Baptists down south somewhere. The Southern Baptist conference leader comes to you and says, we're going to send you up to New England. You're going to be a missionary. And this is what we're going to do for you. We're going to give you a salary. You don't have to raise your own money. The salary's there. We're going to give you a congregation. You don't have to go find this congregation. We're going to give you a building. You don't have to rent at a strip mall or a school. And this building looks like a church. And this building is actually going to be on a green or fairly prominent place in this community. And on top of that, we're going to give you an identity in that. You don't have to go create an identity as a church planter. We're going to give you an identity, even a name, probably a good name. You're not going to have to go make up one of these silly names, Lighthouse or Harbor, you know, in the middle of, 20 miles from the ocean, but you're a harbor or something. You don't have to do that. How many of you would take that assignment? When you said it that way, it made sense. That's what you are. You're a missionary who's been given by God's mercy all of these things already in place. And the only thing you have to do is lead them to Christ, or if they already know Christ, raise them in maturity, in discipleship. It's not that hard. I I think we don't have it so bad. It's hard. It's the hardest thing you'll ever do. But when he put it that way, I stopped whining for about 5 minutes. Right back at it. No, but all right, we're missionaries. Keep that perspective and that expectation. And the people are not the enemy. They're harassed. They're helpless. They don't have a shepherd. They were badly pastored in or the denomination around them let them down. Just like the priests in Israel let the people down. And that's why Christ comes to them and leads them. All right. The third principle is stay in touch. And this is actually a term that Ed Friedman, I don't know if you've read it, I just read it for the first time. Shaking session, I read it years ago. Ed Friedman's book, Generation to Generation. It's a good book. Friedman is no longer living, but he was a rabbi, probably Reformed rabbi, and also a psychologist. In the family systems, theory of therapy. And he talks about the dysfunction and the function of churches and synagogues. And he uses the phrase, stay in touch. And what he means by it is stay in touch with your people in a relationally healthy way. Stay emotionally connected to your people, not in a codependent way or getting sucked into the neuroses that churches. There are unhealthy people in churches. Not getting sucked into that, but staying in connection with people emotionally in a healthy way. The passage I have here is a wonderful one that I confess I really discovered many years after the first 10 years, but it's a good text to help us understand this. It's Paul's words to Timothy about how he's to relate to people. He says, 1 Timothy 5, do not rebuke an older man harshly, but exhort him as if he were your father. That's brilliant. My father's been deceased 20 years now. We're very close. I would never have treated him harshly. I loved him dearly. How do we treat the people in our church? We treat them like they're our problems. That's what Paul says. Because we sort of, unless you're from really an unhappy home, and sometimes people are, you know how intuitively to relate to your family. Your mother, he says, treat older women as mothers. My mother's been gone 5 years. I miss them both. I would never have spoken harshly to my mother. How do we deal with older women in our congregations? I mean, what he's saying is so profound. We know how to relate to our blood relatives. And sometimes they're difficult relationships. But we're so careful, we're so nuanced, we make sure that we don't hurt people. He says, treat younger men like your brothers. I've got 2 brothers. I fought with them when I was a kid, but I love them. Younger women as sisters with absolute purity. That's the answer to all the clergy misconduct, sexual clergy misconduct, right? Women are your sisters. Don't think of them in any other way. Saying, this to me is how we have healthy relationships in our churches. We treat people as we would our own blood relatives. When I first came to the church, the chairman of the diaconate was an older man, probably my father's age or so, and one of the first things he said to me, and my wife remembers this, reminded me of it, I forgot, he said, my job is to protect the church from you. I'm thinking, oh boy, what did I get myself into? I realized, I didn't know at the time, but I realized in hindsight, that my 2 predecessors had hurt the church. They'd driven a lot of people away. They've been, in some ways, I think, abusive. One had an awful temper. The other was just sort of AWOL in many ways. And so he was speaking out of that experience. He was saying, we're not going to let that you know, if you're like that, this church will die. That is not going to happen on my watch. And he was very hard to get along with. He was an engineer, very black and white. He ran the meetings with an iron fist. I was just one other, you know. And he was chairman for a year. I remember the year came to an end. I said, oh, God, thank you. I don't know how I could. And then the next meeting he said, since nobody else wants to be chairman, I'm going to reappoint myself for another year. But you know something? I said I'm going to respect him because he's the chairman. And God has allowed him in that role. I'm going to treat him like my father. And I did. And we became good friends. He was so difficult to work with, but we'd meet over at Jimmy's Allenhurst on Route 114. You know where that restaurant is? And I always remember he'd buy, first thing he'd start off with a martini. And on his lunch break, you know, he's a chemical engineer working in pharmaceuticals. He's into chemicals himself. And so he'd have a martini, then he'd have another one. I think it was a 2-martini lunch. I don't remember. But we became close, and we because I respected him, we saw eye to eye, and he became an effective leader. He gave a testimony. He'd come to Christ. He had a heart attack, near-death experience. He'd come to Christ in the hospital, and he told that story in the pulpit. And then, a year or so after that, God called him to Pennsylvania. And so, I was so, and then, about a year or two after that, he died suddenly in the body. And I was so thankful that I had no regret as to the nature of our relationship, because I treated him like a father. That's staying in touch with him emotionally, but not getting sucked into it, not reacting to him, not, allowing him to dictate how I was going to relate to him. Paul says some wonderful words. Romans 12:18 says, be at peace with everyone if it's possible. Heal relationships. If it's possible, as far as it depends on you, he said, be at peace with everyone. That is an incredible verse. That says I can't allow relationships to go on, to go broken in the church. As far as it depends on me, I've got to heal them. Now, sometimes people don't want to be reconciled, but that's their problem now. My mind and my heart is clear toward them. He also has a very, very profound word in 2 Timothy that we also have to read. Because there are unhealthy people, there are neurotic people who will try to draw you into their neurotic web. And you've got to have boundaries, you've got to understand. So Paul says in 2 Timothy 3, mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. Have nothing to do with them. You know, you expect Paul to say, reform them. No, you don't expect Paul to say that. You expect preachers to reform them, work with them, counsel them. He says, no, there's some people you have to have nothing to do with. Do you remember the movie What About Bob?
Love it.
Love it, great movie. We had a person like that. Richard Dreyfuss is a psychiatrist, Bill Murray's his patient. Bill Murray just insinuates himself entirely into the psychiatrist's life, even to the point where he shows up when you're on vacation. And we had a person like that. I tried to counsel them, and they began to insinuate themselves into our life in a horrible way. I mean, it was dark. And Kathy and I had to break off they were still in the church. We had to say to them, we have nothing to say to you. Do not contact us anymore. We would say that to the person. They went ballistic. Oh man, they called my boss, who's the conference minister, filed a complaint against me. What? You didn't want anything to do with them. It was this verse and John 2 where John says Jesus didn't trust himself to people because he knew it was in their hearts. There are people that you've got to be wise with and have no relationship with, or civil, but you are not going to get drawn into like a spider struggling in the web. reacting to their behavior. And Ed Friedman's book is good in talking about that stuff. So stay in touch, but in healthy ways. All right, decode the conflict. You're going to have conflict, expect it. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's horrible. I hate conflict. I'm not a confrontational person. I try to avoid it, sometimes to a fault. My worst conflict came when we'd been there 10 years. There was a group of people who had been in the church, their home church. It was actually, we thought it was a lot more people. Turned out to be 4 couples. One couple, their 2 grown children and spouses, although the spouses were and their best friends. That's all it turned out to be. They made it sound like everyone was unhappy with my ministry. What had begun to happen was people had begun to come to Christ, new people had started to come into the church, take over positions of leadership, and they were very threatened by this. I didn't handle this well, I'll be honest with you. I was a young man, I would have handled it much differently. But it came to a point where these 8 people were trying to get 25 signatures on a petition to call a congregational meeting to vote to oust me. God is so good. They were Masons, and I don't have anything against Masons. My father was a Mason. He was a wonderful Christian. I'm not a Mason. We had a whole issue with Masons in the church at one point. That's another story. If that's going on in your church, I'd be happy to talk about it. But they're all Masons. They were having their meetings at the Masonic Hall. One woman who had gone through a divorce, the church had cared for her. She was loyal to me in the church. She had heard everything that was going on, and she told us. She was a deacon. She told us everything they were planning to do, so we were one step ahead of them. We let them have a day in court, and it was pathetic. God confounding. They couldn't marshal arguments. They couldn't put anything together. It was all basically the church had been taken out from under them. It was not their old church anymore. God began to do things, and so I wasn't even part of the hearing. I actually was on sabbatical, my first sabbatical after 10 years. But the church, the deacons, the moderator heard them. They took all of their complaints in. They studied them. They wrote a letter that said, "We find no basis to all of your complaints. Cease and desist, basically, and honor your membership vows. Become good members." Well, several of them sang in the choir. Sunday mornings, they'd sing. When I get up to preach, I'll stand up, march down the center aisle, and people are saying, "Jack, you got to do something." I'm not going to do anything. Everybody sees how stupid they are. This is absurd. This is so childish. They did it for about a month. It was in 1987. They never came back. I would see them still, especially this one couple. I wrote to them. I said, "I didn't handle this in the best way. I apologize for the things that I said. They're out of turn. They were hurtful." And they never responded. I'd see them at funerals. Now they're in their late 80s. And I'm at peace with them. That was the conflict that had to come. I would have tried to avoid it. But after they left, it was like a pall was lifted from the church. Because every time I did something wrong, I'd get an angry letter, an angry phone call. And with them gone, the church was set free. And that's when the church came alive. I'm so glad I stayed 10 years. What if I quit after 3 years? That never would have happened. Terry Fulham, I don't know if you know who Terry Fulham is, but he wrote some wonderful books. Episcopal, I was at a conference, and he gave a word of prophecy. He said, "There's a pastor here in this church." It was right. I was on sabbatical, as I said, while this was all going on. He said, "There's a pastor here. There has been an ungodly power chain broken in your church." He was right. He was right. So, conflict's going to come. Expect it, but remember, it's spiritual. It's not flesh and blood, Paul says in Ephesians 6. It's against darkness. And I realize these people, they were lost. They gave a veneer of being Christians, but there was a lostness to them and a control. And they had managed to oust my 2 predecessors, this one family, had managed to drive up, and they thought they would do it again. God said, no, it's not going to happen this time. All right. Decode. Sometimes you have to get outside help to understand the conflict. Conflict is so confusing. And sometimes somebody from the outside can really help you see what's going on. So get that help before you do it. But it's not against flesh and blood. It may be that God has said, I've orchestrated this before the end of time. So this church can be set free. It's my bride. I want this bride pure and spotless. So survive the conflict. Why should you leave? You're the only person in the church that everyone has agreed should be there. Well, let me take that back. Maybe not everybody. You're the only one who was voted in by the whole congregation. Somebody voted against you, right? Am I right? You're Baptist, right? You're Congregationalist. Bishop didn't appoint you. The congregation called you. Why should you leave? Let somebody else leave. Don't ever tell somebody. I never ever once told someone to leave. Don't ever do that. That would come back to bite you. Don't ever do that. But there are people who should leave. You shouldn't leave. You can call. Okay, enough about that. Embrace your history. Do you know why it's founded 15 years before the Civil War? To fight slavery. Right here in New England. It's a fascinating story. You got to read that. That's much more interesting than my piddly time there. When Kathy and I first came to the church, we had no idea that's how this church was founded. And as we began to find out about it, and fortunately, the granddaughter of one of the founders in the 1940s, it was founded in 1940, the 100th anniversary, the granddaughter of one of the founders wrote the story, and it's recorded there of her grandfather's aha moment when he saw a slave auction in South Carolina. He was from Scotland. Slavery had been abolished. He couldn't believe it. He describes it. He couldn't believe human beings. And he vowed to do something. He became very wealthy, mill owner. And when he had an opportunity, he found it. So we were able to leverage that incredible history to say, folks, this is who we are. This church cared about the widows and orphans, the code and the Bible. They cared about ending human suffering, and they did it in the name of Christ. They weren't liberals, they were biblical, they're evangelical Christians. So he said, what are we doing? How about it, folks? We say this is who we are, where we came from. What are we doing? Martin Luther King Jr. did that. He levered the Constitution against America. He said, you say all people are created equal. You say you believe that. How about it, folks? And that's what you can do if you know your history, designed to reach the part of the community where you are. How about it, folks? Are we doing that? He said this is where it came from. So, and people in New England value history. So understand your own history, the long history. Understand the short history too. Why people do things. Our church in Manchester, Maine, has a big wooden box at the back of the sanctuary with a padlock. It's like a big literally a soap box, like an antique box you find at a flea market or something. It's got a slot at the top. And it's what's it called, the Joash? Who's Joash? Help me out. I'm not that good at names.
He's one of the kings who establishes the box in the sanctuary in order to refurbish the temple.
See? All right. I knew we'd have a...
Andover Newton!
I knew we'd have a... Hallelujah. Let's sing the fight song at the Andover Newton. Anyway, that's what Joash...
Wow.
So I'm wondering what the heck this thing is. We put a check in it about a month ago on Ash Wednesday. It hasn't been cashed yet. It's still sitting in there. So this Sunday when we go, I'm going to demand my money. No. But I'm thinking when I take over here in the fall, I'm going to first thing I'm going to do is get rid of that stupid thing. You don't even check it for months. I'm not going to do that. Now that I know who Joash is. But there's a reason why they do the things they do. Maybe your Constitution is wicked restrictive, probably because the previous pastors abused the people. Maybe your worship service, they don't let you make a change because the guy who was there before you brought in heavy metal, worship music. I don't know. There's reasons why, though, and that's your brief history. Understand your history and embrace it. It's who they are. We have a Founders Day. We celebrate our history. A few years ago, on an anniversary, Kathy put together a cantata. It was beautifully done. Just incredible, based on the founding of our church. So celebrate. That's who you are. Honor it, because that's how God has worked in the past. And you are benefiting from decisions that were made 50 years ago, 100 years ago, maybe 200 years, maybe 300 years ago. The choice of that location. Who's the fellow whose church burned down? I was going to ask you, how's the fire? Shh, it's next week. Come on, it's the old arsonist joke. Anyway. Maybe. Just got it. You say, hey, I heard about your fire. Anyway. But you're the recipient of decisions that were made in your past that have blessed you. And God, Jesus delays his return 100 years from now. There are going to be people who are blessed because of decisions you made. We're in this continuum in our time of being at the helm of this pulpit, this church, is just a very little slice of the long history, but it's so important. So value history, God, okay, moving along there. Follow the leaders. Pastors have a leadership gift. You wouldn't be in the pasture if you didn't have a leadership gift. Sometimes we don't think we do. I didn't think I did, because I had in mind what a leader, looked like, and I was not like that. I was much more passive and very conciliatory. I hate conflict, very consensus oriented. But I began to read in leadership positions. That's that Romans 12 passage where Paul says, "If you have a leadership gift, lead, do it." And I realized I was not leading, and I realized I had to be more of an initiator in leadership. And the term that Lyle Shouter uses is the tribal chief, the pastor, and you're going to get to hear tomorrow from the tribal chief. Yes, what would be the female version? Because chiefette, like raisinette, right? Usher. I'm sorry.
Marionette.
Kathy is going to talk about wives. You have authority, and you also can exercise this tribal chief. I had to understand that I was the tribal chief. Doesn't mean I did everything, but it meant I had to initiate leadership. I had to lead. If I didn't lead, other people would step forward, sometimes not with the best results. Sometimes lots of confusion, or nobody would lead. And so you've got to lead, and you've got to get comfortable with your leadership style. I realized that I am a hands-off leader. I don't like to manage people. I don't do it well. We eventually ended up with quite a large staff. But the way it worked was, one, I got people who were self-starters. I didn't always do that. Sometimes I picked people that I had to manage. We had some horror stories. I could tell you some of them. They were painful. We had people in positions that were not good for the church. And I couldn't manage them because I'm not a good manager. So I picked people eventually, or we picked people, it was always me, we picked people who were self-motivated, who knew what God had called them to do, and they did it. And the other thing is, we got a wonderful administrator who's on our staff, and she is great. And she handles all of the HR stuff, if you have paid staff, which you may now, you probably do some now. Anyway, I had to understand my style of leadership. And I also had to understand that leaders are both made and born. You know the expression, leaders are made, not born, or born, not made. I'm not sure what it is, but they're both. But you have to see, you can't put in what God left out. It has to be, and so look for the people who are leading. And one of our best elders, and we eventually went to an elder system, and that's a whole other story. We'd have to talk a little bit about that. One of our best elders was a man who was the head usher. He was just faithful. I saw, he organized it, he led it, and he became one of our best elders. And we just saw him last week in Halifax in Florida, of all places. But anyway, So find the people who are leading, and maybe they can be developed. But if somebody is not leading, it's hard to make them a leader. And you will get people like that. Early on, it's all hands on deck. You take whoever you can. And we had a motto. It was actually Vince Lombardi, the great Green Bay Baptist coach, who said, "Win with the team you have. Not play with the team you have. Everybody has to play with it. Win with the team you have." And so we had some odd things, odd people in positions of serving and leadership. But we said, this is who God's given us, and we're going to go with them. And over time, God brought other people along who had gifts of leadership, and it began to change. There's a whole thing on leadership tomorrow that Jim's going to do, so I won't steal any more of this thunder. But part of that is gift theology. Understand gift theology. Paul with Peter Mason, great deal talk about gifts. Romans 12, 1 Corinthians 12, Ephesians 4, 1 Peter 4. Gifts are important. So early on, we had people who were in positions of leadership with no gifting for it. And you have to sort of put up with it, wait it out, pray. But when things begin to change, you can look for people who are gifted and put them in. Now, gifting is relative. Paul says that. There's different measures of gifts. But you put people in positions who have a gift for that. And we use that term, gift theology, on the basis of whether someone is allowed to sing, or someone's allowed to preach or teach. Do they have a gift? Have they demonstrated some gifting in that area? If not, we're not going to put them in, we wouldn't put them in a position of leadership. Now, Groundhog Day, we're starting all over. We've got folks in the dear church in Maine that we love them, but I talk about lint-picking moments. You know what a lint-picking moment is? A lint-picking moment is one of those embarrassing moments when someone's up front singing, speaking, and it's so bad you can't look at them. And so you look at the lint. Yeah. You're picking lint off your pants or your shirt or whatever because it's that embarrassing. We have some lint-picking moments on Sunday mornings, and I don't know what I'm going to do. But they're good people, they're dear people. At some point, though, we have to, I go slow, 35 years, I'll be 100 and, I can't do the math, so numbers are so big. But at some point, you're going to say, gift theology, this person is not gifted. The gifts are not just about who we are, kind of understanding what we are to do. No, it's how God runs his church. That's what Paul's saying. So anyway, let's move on. Change agent. Wonderful text. 2 Corinthians 5. Paul talks about the ministry of reconciliation. And he says, from now on we regard no one from a worldly point of view, though we once regarded Christ this way. We do so no longer. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, is a new creature. The old is gone, the new is come. All of this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. The word reconciliation is a great word. It's a word basically catalyst. It's a change agent. That's what you are. You're a change agent. God's called you to introduce change into his body. That is the most vital thing we will do in a replanting situation is introduce change. And it's the most difficult thing to do. But that's what we're called to do. You're a change agent. You've been given a ministry of catalyzing things. And part of it is at different stages in the life of the church, the atmosphere for change may be better or worse. And I won't get into detail on this. I could if anybody has a specific question afterward. But understanding and sort of deciphering how God is going to transform your church, because you don't transform it, he does. But he'll use you. He uses human beings. He uses leadership. He would use you to transform that church. And understanding how that is going to happen is a challenge, but it's what we're called to do. What we are called to lead change. A huge part of it is earning the trust of the people, loving them, and Dale's going to talk about that tomorrow his thunder, but it's about loving these people. You don't beat the sheep, you feed the sheep. And loving these people that God has given to us, and as Jesus said, as we saw Jesus had compassion for us. And it's the old thing, people don't care what you know, until you care. And that is profound truth of that. So, finally, healthy pastors fostering healthy churches. We've got to be healthy. We don't grow our churches. Growth is not our concern. Growth is an organic thing, as we know. Whether it's human growth, whether it's plant growth, church growth, it's an organic thing. And Jesus teaches that. It's the parable in Mark 4. It's one of my favorite. I call it the lazy pastor's parable. It says, this is what the kingdom of God is like. A man scatters seed on the ground night and day, whether he sleeps or gets up. Doesn't matter what he does, the seed sprouts and grows, though he does not know how. It was Martin Luther who, commenting on that verse on the tabletop, probably hung up his beer. He said, while I drink my little glass of Wittenberg beer, the gospel runs its course. Isn't that great? In other words, you can take a day off. God's still going to work. You can take your vacation, you go on sabbatical. You can have that glass of beer. 2. Martin Luther certainly did. And tell you a great story. We went to Wittenberg. Tell you a great story about that. He ran up a $10,000 tab at the local pub. He stopped every day on his way home. $10,000 in there. And the pub is still there. You can go and have a beer there. We did.
Put it on his tab.
Huh? Yeah, it is. It's no. But it's called the Golden Eagle. If you ever get to Wittenberg, go there. And so the richest man in the town owned the pub, Lucas Cranach, who was in very fortunes. We have a Lucas Cranach. I'm sorry, the pub owner went to Lucas Cranach, the richest man in Wittenberg, and said, Mr. Cranach, he owes me $10,000. Should I go after him? And Cranach was thinking of this guy who faced down the Pope in Rome. And said, no, I'll take care of it. The gospel the gospel is powerful. Don't count your attendance. It's sometimes not hard to look out with one hand. But I got to the point where I stopped checking the attendance because when it was high, I said, hey, this is going to be easier than I thought. I'm doing pretty good. When it was low, I was depressed. And it meant nothing. It might have had to do with the weather. And so I said, I'm not going to do that. And so I literally stopped checking the attendance. I could not tell you, what the attendance is, because that wasn't important. Growth is God's concern. Health is our concern. We're to be healthy ourselves, spiritually healthy. One of the most important things we did in our first 10 years there was we were in a covenant group with other pastors about our age and their wives. It lasted 10 years. And it gave us a life outside the church. Kathy sort of talked about that. That was one healthy thing we did. That was, in fact, one of those guys is my best friend now, Bill Murdoch, Maureen's brother. Bishop Bill, he's a bishop in the Anglican Church in Orlando. But anyway, that group was my salvation. I would not have lasted without that group. We prayed for each other. We wept. We supported one another. We kept one another accountable. It's important. You need that. It's too easy to be isolated. It's hard work. Healthy with your family. And again, the women are going to talk about that tomorrow. So important. Healthy emotionally. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got was from Young Life. Young Life influenced us a lot. We were actually Westwood associated with Young Life. One of the things that Young Life leaders, we had to raise their funds. It was always very iffy. They said, always keep an option. Always keep another vocational option nearby. That's something we need to do. Rabbis used to do that. The rabbi told me historically all rabbis had a bivocation. Paul was a leather worker. Jesus was a carpenter. They always had something because the history of persecution of Judaism was such that you never knew if you were going to lose your synagogue. A black pastor Henry Brooks. I don't know if he was still at Andover Newton, he's deceased. He was a pastor in Roxbury, he was a professor at Andover Newton, and his family had a finished carpentry business even. It was actually moldings, all the moldings that you see like in churches and in city buildings. His family business did that. And so he said all black pastors are bivocational because, again, same thing with the Jewish. You know, there's persecution in our history. The economy, you don't know. I think every pastor, especially in replanting, we need to have something that we could do. Maybe you can teach. For me, it was knowing that I could counsel. I didn't want to. After I knew my calling was pastor, that was the last thing in the world I wanted to do. I didn't do counseling in the church. I would hear someone once, hear their story, and then I'd refer them to one Christian counselor. Because counseling's hard work. It's a lot of problems with a lot of problems. But I knew I could do that. I would have to get certified by the state, but I had the degree, I could do that. And I could go hang out and shingle. And that kept me from being desperate. Because there would be people at a board meeting who would say it jokingly, but there was a message to say, well, Pastor, we can cut your salary. And I remember once a woman said that, and I said, well, you know, that would be all right, because I'd go hang out my shingle and I'd double what you're paying me. I never heard that again. I didn't want to do that. It was kind of a bluff on my part. But I could, in knowing that there was something nearby, because life is uncertain. I didn't know that I'd stay there 35 years. I had no idea what that 10-year mark would be. I don't know. You don't know. And so, have something, not that you're going to do it, but it'll keep you in those weak moments of feeling desperate, feeling vulnerable, or being bullied, because there are bullies sometimes in churches. All right, a lot there, but replanters, you know, we've got to be like New England farmers. We've got to be hopeful. We've got to be persistent. We've got to be persevering. But I think when you look back on it, like I can from 35 years, I wouldn't change a thing. I would have gotten smarter earlier, but I wouldn't change